You know, when a building is on fire, you have the people who are living or working in that building who are going to race out of the building as fast as they can in order to get away from the danger of that fire. But there are a few people, firemen, who will actually race toward the building and go into the building in order to see if there's any others who need to be rescued and to extinguish the flames if possible. In much the same way, when there's a raging forest fire, you will see people, as the fire is coming toward a town, they will evacuate the town in the direction away from the fire. But you will see firemen who will come to that town on the side where the fire is located in order to build a fire break, hopefully to save the structures of that town. If there's a active shooter event taking place, most people are screaming and yelling as they're running away from the shooter, but you'll have police officers who will race toward the shooter in order to eliminate the danger that exists in that moment. Even like on the field of battle, often if the bullets are flying, you will see the soldiers who will take cover, but at times you will see a medic. If there's someone wounded out in the open, they will crawl, risking their life in order to get to that person, in order to give them life-saving treatment before it's too late. Now, I share all of these examples of these emergency responders and how they have skill sets and they have an attitude that they will risk their lives in order to help other people who are in danger. Now, I use this as an example because I want to paint a picture for you today from Luke chapter 18, in which we see Jesus as the ultimate eternal emergency responder. But folks, Jesus is responding to an emergency that no police officer, no fireman, no medic, no medical professional can respond to. He's responding to the danger of the consequences of sin. This is an eternal danger and ultimately results in the flames of hell. But like on the earth, we see emergency responders who, instead of running from danger, they will run to the danger. Jesus, when it comes to this eternal emergency, he doesn't run away from danger for himself. He runs actually to the danger, because he understood he is the only one who can actually rescue people from the flames of hell. And I want to think about him today on this Easter Sunday, resurrection morning, as the ultimate eternal emergency responder and rescuer. And I want us to see, just like we understand earthly responders, that they have the attitude that they will rush toward the danger. Jesus rushed toward the danger when he did not have to do so. But he did it knowing he is the only hope for sinners like you and like me. And I want us to understand this on this Easter Sunday Resurrection Day. And I want to do this, I want to paint this picture for you by looking in Luke chapter 18, just 3 short verses, 31, 32, 33, we are going to see how everything that Jesus went toward in the week of Passion that we've been celebrating this week, everything he went toward, he knew that he was going toward all of this, and he allowed every bit of it to happen to him. Those are the 2 basic premises of this sermon. 1, Jesus knew every bit of trouble that he was getting himself into. He knew it. And 2, he allowed it. And as we celebrate Jesus this morning, I want us to celebrate him as that eternal emergency responder for us. So let's begin with what he knew. Jesus knew what was prophesied about him. We read in Luke chapter 18, verse 31, these words. It says, then he, the he here is Jesus, then he took the 12 apostles. He took them aside and he said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. So now these are the words. This is a conversation that Jesus was having with his 12 apostles, not in the week of the Passion, but 2 or 3 weeks earlier. They were in the city of Jericho, several miles away from Jerusalem, and Jesus is having this conversation with them, and he's telling them the schedule. Very soon, we are going to go to Jerusalem for the Passover week. Now, his disciples, as well as Jesus himself, understood what this meant. This basically meant that Jesus knowingly and willingly was signing his death warrant. They understood, Jesus himself understood, that if he goes to Jerusalem at this time in his ministry, he will surely die. And Jesus still, knowing this, chose to do it. How did he know this? I contend he knew it in two ways. Number one, Jesus knew from present circumstances what would happen to him if he went to Jerusalem. Present circumstances. Notice verse 31, the first part again. Then Jesus took the 12 aside and he said to them, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem." His disciples understood that Jesus' greatest, most powerful, and most hateful enemies resided in the city of Jerusalem at this time. They knew that when Jesus said, "We are going to Jerusalem for Passover week," they knew they were going into the belly of the beast. That the most dangerous enemies that Jesus had lived and worked right there in Jerusalem. Now, why were they so angry? Why were they so bloodthirsty for Jesus? It is because for the previous 3 years, Jesus had been doing ministry. He had been saying things. He had been doing things that had provoked their ire and their anger. And these things that they thought were wrong, we know was right. But it enraged these chief priests and elders to the point they wanted to kill Jesus. What were the kinds of things that he did? In John chapter 2, that's the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We read how Jesus went to Jerusalem for one of the holidays. He went to Jerusalem, and when he went into the courtyard of the temple, he saw something that made him upset and angry. He saw vendors all over the courtyard there surrounding the temple, and these vendors had been given permission by the chief priests and the elders to sell their products right there in the temple courtyard. Right where the temple courtyard had been dedicated to prayer, the chief priests had extended permission to basically set up a flea market. That's the best thing that we can think about that. It was like a flea market, and when Jesus came in there at the beginning of his earthly ministry, he saw this, it angered him, and what did he do? He got some leather, and he began to braid a whip. Now, this takes a while. Have y'all ever braided leather? It takes a while, which means this was not a spontaneous reaction. This was a very deliberate, calculated action that Jesus did in the very first days of his ministry. He braided this whip, and once it was finished, he began to turn over all of the tables in those stalls. He began to snap that whip at these vendors, and they all ran away, fearing this Jesus. Now, when the chief priest who had given permission found out what this Jesus, this new guy on the block, had done, they approached him and they said, "By what authority have you done this?" And Jesus told these most, famous, these most powerful religious leaders, he said, "Look, this courtyard is meant to be a house of prayer for my Father. And you've turned it into a den of thieves by letting this flea market take place here." And the religious leaders from that moment forward realized, here's a guy that's going to cause some trouble. And they had their eyes on Jesus from that point forward. Now, that wasn't cleansing the temple. That wasn't the only time he cleansed it. That was at the beginning of his ministry. You see, when Jesus and his disciples leave Jericho, they go to the village of Bethany, and then they go on to Jerusalem for what we call the Week of Passion. One of the first things Jesus will do in the future at the Week of Passion is he will cleanse the temple again. He will once again braid the whip, and he will turn over all of the vendors' booths just like he had 3 years earlier, and he will drive them out with that whip. And it's like Jesus, when he comes in this final time before his crucifixion, he's saying to the chief priest, "I'm back. I'm back. You remember when we had this instance 3 years ago? I'm back again, and I'm saying the same thing. You've turned this house of God into a den of thieves." Now, this wasn't the only thing that Jesus did to provoke the chief priests and the elders. He would do miracles. Now you would think miracles, this is great. He would do miracles on Monday, Tuesday. He'd do miracles all week long. He would also do miracles, whether in the north in Galilee or down south, even in Jerusalem. He would also do them on the Sabbath. Now you say, what's the big deal? Because God had given Moses the law hundreds of years earlier, but the rabbis through those years had also created the tradition of the elders. These were rules by which they told the people, look, here's what God says to do. Here's how we teach you to do those things. Now, the thing about the Sabbath is they basically said you can't do anything other than just go to synagogue, go to temple, and worship God. Nothing else. If you're a tailor, you can't even have a needle in your outfit on the Sabbath. Otherwise, you would be carrying the implement, the tool of your trade, and that would be a sin. You can't walk but only so many feet away from your house to the local synagogue in order to worship on the Sabbath. They had all of these rules, none of which God had given. God gave the law. Man made the traditions. Well, when Jesus would perform miracles during the week and he would also perform miracles on the Sabbath, they said, that's work, that's wrong. And at one time, Jesus told these chief priests, he said, look, the Sabbath, man was not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. In other words, as God the Son, he understood better than any of these chief priests that God gave the Sabbath for a day of rest, for a day of focusing on the Lord. It was for the benefit of man. It was not a rule that men had to conform to if they were going to be right with God. It wasn't meant as a rule. It was meant as a relational time of rest and focus on the Lord. And then Jesus said to those same chief priests, he said, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, the religious leaders understood at that point that Jesus was declaring himself to be the Son of Man, and they understood at that point that he just declared himself to be Lord over the holy day of God. They understood he was claiming to be God in the flesh at that moment, and they rightly understood that. They believed Jesus was a heretic. They believed Jesus, if he continued this way, had to be stopped, even if it meant his death. And Jesus knew that as well when he was carrying on this conversation with his disciples there in Jericho, and he said, you know what? Very soon we're going to go up to Jerusalem. We're going up into the belly of the beast, where my most dangerous enemies are. Now, once they left Jericho, they went to Bethany about a week out from the Passover. We know that Jesus performed one of his greatest miracles right there before the week of the Passover. One of his friends had died and had been dead for 4 days. Jesus knew about it while he was at Jericho, but he waited purposely. His friend Lazarus had died 4 days. The body would have already begun to rot in the tomb. Jesus came. And one of his greatest miracles is when he said, Lazarus, come forth out of the grave. And Lazarus rose from the grave. Now, you're talking about Bethany, a small village. I grew up in a very small town in Kentucky, 500 people. Everybody knew everybody's business in Science Hill, Kentucky, just like everybody knew everybody's business in Bethany. So everybody knew that Lazarus had died 4 days earlier. Everybody knew Lazarus' body probably had already begun to stink from the decomposition process. And everybody saw Lazarus walking in the streets of their village of Bethany. And they're like, how did this happen? And Mary and Martha and others in the family said, it was Jesus. Now, that Bethany is 2 miles away from Jerusalem. And you know how that kind of news flies around. The residents of Jerusalem began to hear about this Lazarus who'd been raised from the dead right before Passover. And here comes residents out to see the dead man walking. The dead man who the whole village knew was really dead. They wanted to see how he's alive now. And they began to hear about Jesus even having power over the death. How do you think the chief priests back in Jerusalem, right before Passover, biggest holiday of the year, how do you think they were feeling at this moment? They were incensed. And they wanted this man dead. Folks, Jesus knew all of this. Before he even got there, while he was talking to his disciples here in Luke 18 in Jericho, he said, we are going up to Jerusalem. And even his disciples knew from the circumstances of the ministry they had been involved with that this was the death warrant. In fact, Thomas said, we might as well all go with him and die together. They knew what this meant. Why would Jesus go to Jerusalem if the circumstances revealed to him what it's going to mean, his death? Why would he do that? And I would contend because he knew that sinners are in danger of the flames of hell. And he knew if he run away from the danger, we would die. But if he runs to the danger, we might live. And that's why he said, we're going to Jerusalem, knowing all of these things. But folks, he didn't know it just because of the extenuating circumstances of his 3 years of ministry. He also knew it because as the Son of God, he knew the prophecies about him in the week of Passion that he knew was coming very soon. That's the second thing. Jesus knew from past prophecies what would happen to him. Verse 31, second part, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. Jesus had been claiming, that's his favorite moniker for himself. He would say, I, the Son of Man, I, the Son of Man. And here he said, all of the things written in the scriptures by the prophet about the Son of Man, and his disciples knew, well, that's him. They will be accomplished now. Now, what kind of prophecies from the scriptures did Jesus know was about to be accomplished that week of the Passover? Well, Jesus knew that the first day he comes, probably on a Sunday, he would come in riding a donkey. How did Jesus know that weeks before it ever happened? Because Jesus knew the prophecies of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. In this prophecy, it says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation. Here's the key. Lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. You see, Jesus understood this was not just talking about an event during the days of Zechariah. This is a prophecy about when Messiah, he understood himself to be Messiah, when Messiah would enter into Jerusalem, when all these things would take place, he knew the Messiah would enter in on a donkey. And sure enough, his triumphal entry just a couple of weeks later was on a donkey. Now, what's up with this donkey thing? You got to understand, in ancient Israel, they would have understood this. In the times of the kings of Israel, they would have two forms of transportation. The king, when he would go out into the city streets of Jerusalem, would either ride on a donkey during times of peace, or he would ride on a war horse when he was leading Israel out to battle against their enemies. So we understand from the Bible that Jesus, the Son of Man, the Messiah, he will come two different times in human history. The first time he comes, known as the first advent, if you've heard that term before, the first time he would come riding a donkey. You know, this is the incarnation that we celebrate at Christmas. This goes all the way up to what we celebrate on Easter Resurrection Sunday. That Jesus would enter in at the beginning of the week on a donkey because he was not coming as God, the destroyer, who's going to put down all of his enemies. The first time Jesus came, he came as the servant who was going to, Prince of Peace, who was going to make a way of peace where God's enemies might actually come back into a peaceful relationship with the one they have been fighting with ever since they sinned. That's why he understood the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, that yes, I will go in this week of Passion riding on a donkey, symbolizing I'm coming to make the way of peace with God possible. But in the book of Revelation, we read where the second time Christ returns, he will return in the clouds, riding, do you know what it says? Riding a war horse, a white horse. And this time, and we're still waiting for this one, when he returns again, he returns to put down, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, all of his enemies and judgment to take place thereafter. But in the first advent, the one we're talking about right now, he came riding on a donkey, just as the Messianic prophecy said. But he also knew going to Jerusalem that day and that week that he would be betrayed And he knew he'd be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. How did he know that? Because he knew the prophecies his father, had inspired the Holy Spirit to give hundreds of years earlier. He knew Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12 and 13 that says, "Then I said to them, it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain." So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, "Throw it to the potter. That princely price they set on me." So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. Now, last week we talked about this in the previous sermon last week. And what we see is God tells his prophet Zechariah, "You go to the chief priest there at the temple in Jerusalem, and you tell them that God has been giving you the prophecy that you've been given to them, and that God now demands you to pay me as his prophet what I am worth." And they gave him 30 pieces of silver. Now, what we don't understand is that when you go back into the book of Exodus, you find out that 30 pieces of silver was the price, the cheapest price to be paid for a slave. So when those chief priests gave Zechariah 30 pieces of silver, it was actually an insult to the prophet of God, because we're saying, you're no better to us than a cheap slave. And not just an insult to the prophet, but to the God who had given the prophet the words to give to the chief priest. They were saying, your word is no more good to us than a cheap slave. It was an insult. But Jesus understood that this insult in Zechariah's day was actually a historical illustration of what would be fulfilled in the Messiah's day, when he would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. By whom? The chief priest. They would pay 30 pieces of silver to Judas Iscariot, saying basically, not the prophet of God, Zechariah, but the Son of God, Jesus, is worth for us no more than a cheap slave. An insult to God and his Son. But Jesus also knew that it was one of his closest friends who would betray him, because he knew Psalm 41:9. "Even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." He knew it would be one of his familiar friends who would cheat on him. I believe from the time that he selected and invited Judas Iscariot to become one of his 12, he knew Judas was going to be the one to betray him. And yet he still befriended him and loved on him and treated him just like all of the others, knowing that this week was the week that Judas would betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Now, I don't know about you, but if I knew these things, I might try to do something about it. How about you? But Jesus didn't do any of it. He let it go forward. And it wasn't that he would just be betrayed. He knew that this betrayal would lead to his torture. How did he know that? Because he knew Isaiah 53, verse 5 and 7, this prophecy. "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him." And here's the key. "By his stripes we have been healed." By his stripes. He knew these were stripes on the body that he had taken upon himself. These are after a torturous whipping, that there would be just stripes, wounds all over his body. He knew when he was talking to his disciples in Jericho, he knew he was heading to Jerusalem to be tortured. And he didn't run away from the danger. What did he do? He ran toward the danger. And he knew it wasn't just torture. He knew he was going to be killed. How did he know this? Because he knew verse 7 that says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so Messiah would not open up his mouth." He was going silently, knowing that he was God's sacrificial lamb. He knew all this before he even went, and he chose to go anyway. He knew how he was going to die. He knew this because he knew Psalm 22, and in Psalm 22, verses 16 through 18, it says, "For dogs have surrounded me, the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." He knew he wasn't going to be stoned to death. He was going to die on a cross, because this is an ancient form of torturous execution. And he knew what my hands and feet being pierced meant, that he would be nailed to a cross that would be suffering beyond virtually all human imagination. He knew this, and he went anyway. He knew he would die rapidly on the cross because verse 17 says, I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. He's talking about the understanding that this torturous death, that usually in order to speed up the death, the people who put the person on the cross, they would break the legs so that that person on the cross would die more rapidly. But he knew prophetically his legs would not be broken. He could count them all. They were all complete and intact. So he knew he was going to die very rapidly. The torture, he knew, would be so severe that he would have virtually no life when they hung him on the cross. He knew that. And he knew while he was hanging on the cross what was going to take place at his feet. Verse 18, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. He knew that the very clothes that he was arrested in the night before, he knew that they would mockingly be gambled for at the foot of the cross the way the Roman soldiers did it. He knew all of this stuff because he knew the prophecies, and he knew the anger, the hatred that these religious leaders had for him. And between the circumstances and the prophecies, he knew exactly what he was getting himself into. Now, why would anybody go to this certain horrific death? It's because he knew he would not stay dead long. How did he know that? Because he knew the prophecy of Psalm 16:10. For you will not leave my soul in Sheol. This is the words of Messiah to God the Father. You will not leave my soul in Sheol, a Hebrew word that means the grave. You will not leave me dead very long. In fact, this prophecy says, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. In other words, I will not be in the grave long enough that my body begins to decompose and rot. I'm coming out of the grave. He knew that as well. And he knew the reason that he had to die and be raised, because he knew the prophecy of Isaiah 53:10. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. That's hard to believe. Here the Lord is the Father. It pleased the Father that his Son would be bruised. The Father has put the Son to grief. And when you make his soul an offering for sin, see, Jesus understood that. I got to go and be tortured and die as an offering for sin. He knew this passage. So when you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. Jesus understands, I will see my Father. He, the Father, shall prolong his days, the Messiah's days. He knew he would be raised from the dead, and his days of life would be prolonged forever and ever. He knew that. And the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. The Father's will, his pleasure, would prosper through what the Son did as the offering for sinners like you and me. So you ask the question, why would Jesus, had he known all of this stuff, why would he go through all of this suffering? It's because he knew the reason. He is the eternal emergency responder and rescuer. And he knew if he ran from all of this danger, you and I would have no hope whatsoever. But he ran toward the danger for his own life so that he could make his life an offering so you and I can be rescued from the flames of hell. That's what he knew. And that's why he allowed what he allowed. That's the second thing I want us to see this morning. Jesus didn't just know it, he allowed it. Jesus allowed what was prophesied about him. We see that in verses 32 and 33. For he will be delivered. Now, Jesus is talking about the prophecies. He said all of the prophecies about the Son of Man will be accomplished this week when we go to Jerusalem. And here's a compilation of the ideas of these prophecies he's referencing. For he, the he right here is Messiah, which would be Jesus. For he will be delivered to the Gentiles, and he will be mocked and insulted and spit upon. They will scourge him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again. Now, Jesus is saying this to his disciples there in Jericho. He's using the third person singular, he, the pronoun he. That's because that's the way it was written in the Old Testament prophecies. But Jesus understood in the Old Testament those third person singular pronouns in the moment that he is living in can be transformed into first person singular I will be delivered to the Gentiles. He understood, I will be mocked. I will be insulted. I will be spit upon. I will be scourged, and I will be killed. He understood that. But he also understood, and I will rise again. He didn't just know this. He allowed this. If you knew there was danger right there in front of you, what would you probably do? I'd probably run from the danger. He ran toward it. And by running toward it, he allowed it. Now, folks, you got to understand, Jesus did not have to allow all of this to take place against him. He did not have to allow it. He could have stopped it in the very beginning. He could have stopped it any time all the way up to the end. He could have stopped it. He could have stopped it like Barney Fife says. He could have nipped it in the bud had he chosen. What do I mean by nipping it in the bud? I mean, from the very beginning, he did not have to become human to allow this human torture to be foisted upon him. He didn't have to become human. You see, in Philippians chapter 2, we read verses 5 through 7. It says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Now, this is Paul talking to the Philippian church, and he's saying, look, this mindset, this attitude that I want you to have, church, this is the attitude that Jesus had when he came and made salvation possible. What is the attitude? Verse 6 and 7 gives us Jesus' attitude and what he did. Who, Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. Now what he's saying is, he takes the morphe, that's the Greek word, the form of a human being. He's in the form, but he is God. In the form of God. He's got physicality in human form, but he is God, and therefore he understood it is not robbery to consider himself to be equal with God. As God the Son, he knew he was equal with God the Father. He's equal with God the Holy Spirit. He understood in this Trinitarian way, I am God in the flesh. That's exactly what ticked off the religious leaders so much, but Jesus knew this was right. But he knew that the Father had willed, his pleasure was for his Son to go and take on human flesh. It's called the incarnation. It's what we celebrate at Christmas. Baby Jesus, from the moment of conception to his birth, that is the incarnation, God being in flesh supernaturally. But Jesus knew the first time he comes, he is not coming as this huge king that everybody's going to fear and bow before him. No, notice in verse 7, but he made himself of no reputation. He'd be born and hardly anybody in the world would know or care about his birth, as we read in the Gospels. And he was taking on the form not of this massive king, this intelligent philosopher that everybody would ooh and ah over. No, he took on the form of a bondservant, a servant, a slave in the likeness of men, a human slave. He came to be tortured, to be betrayed by the base price for a slave. He came to do all of this stuff in order to rescue us as the offering for sin from the flames of hell. The eternal emergency responder and rescuer. He came. He didn't have to come. God could have just simply said, they have rebelled and they will die and go to hell. He could have done that, but he didn't. He came in the flesh as a servant. So on one level, he could have nipped it in the bud, but he didn't. On another level, he could have stopped it any time he wanted. Anytime he wanted. You say, how do you know that? Because we read in Matthew 26, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the mob came and Judas gave Jesus that betraying kiss and that identified to the mob who Jesus was and they seized him, we read in Matthew 26 how Peter drew a sword. The Apostle Peter drew a sword and whacked the ear of the high priest's servant Malchus. Cut the ear off. And you know what Jesus said? Jesus said, put up your sword. And in verse 26, we read what else? Verse 53, we read what else Jesus said to Peter. He said, or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and my Father will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? Now, you understand what that means? He's telling Peter, I don't need you to protect me. I can stop this anytime I want. And it'd be a whole lot more effective than you, Peter, with that little sword that you missed what you were aiming for. He's saying, I can have my Father. All I got to do is say, Abba, Father, Daddy, I'm done. And my Father would send 12 legions, 72,000 angels. Do you all realize that only 2 angels totally wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah? Imagine what 72,000 angels could do. All Jesus had to say, I'm done. And the Father would rescue his Son from all the torment that he was experiencing. But he didn't. Why? Because he knew his job was to race toward the danger, not run away from it. Because he was racing toward his danger to save us from our danger. The eternal emergency responder and rescuer. Jesus understood, and I want you to understand, he allowed it. He permitted it. He could have stopped it anytime he wanted. He permitted it. What did he permit? Very quickly, 3 things. Jesus allowed his arrest and trial. Verse 32, for he will be delivered to the Gentiles and will be mocked and insulted and spit. This is prophecy that was revealing how the mob would seize Jesus, that evening they would take Jesus to the home or the courtyard of the high priest, and they would have this scam trial. Even by their own traditions, they weren't allowed to declare someone, capital punishment where they're condemned to die. They weren't allowed to do this at night by their own rules, but they did it anyway. That's why the next morning, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Sanhedrin, had to convene the Sanhedrin again and rubber stamp what they had decided the night before. And when they did that, what the Sanhedrin did was they took Jesus to the Roman governor, Pilate, because the Romans would not allow the Jewish people to execute any longer. So they had to take him to the Gentile ruler, just like prophecy had said. Now, in that trial, that evening before, we can read in the Gospels that while Jesus was on trial, he was silent through most of it, and they mocked him, they spat upon him. The temple guards, they would slap him and jokingly say, "Who slapped you? Prophesy that." And they did all of this stuff. And Jesus knew it was going to happen. And he permitted it. Every bit of it. He not only allowed his arrest and trial, Jesus allowed his torture and crucifixion. Verse 33, first part, they will scourge him and kill him. Scourging is a nice sanitized way of saying that the Roman soldiers who tortured Jesus would torture him with what was known as the cat o' nine tails. It was one handle of a whip, but there were 9 cords coming off that one handle. And at the end of each cord, it's well documented outside of the Bible history, they would put sharp metal objects, sharpened bone, stones, anything sharp, and they would put it at the end of each cord. And when that soldier would sling and snap that cat of 9 tails onto a body, those sharp objects, when they hit, they stuck. And when he pulled back on that whip, skin came back with it. Those are the stripes that Jesus knew he was going toward. But it was more than stripes. It was stripes, and it was probably gashes and chunks of skin that was flying with blood everywhere. Jesus knew it. Scourging. And he permitted it. And he knew it wasn't just going to be torture. He knew he would die. That he would be killed. And he knew how he would be killed, as I said a few moments ago, because he knew the prophecies. He knew he would be pierced. He knew it would be on the cross. He knew that those nails, after his torture, would be driven into his hands, into his feet. These aren't little nails. These are big nails. Big nails, big enough to handle skinny guys. Big nails, big enough to handle fat guys. It didn't matter what the weight was. These nails and that wood was strong enough to handle any size guy. And they were driven into him even after the torture. And Jesus permitted both, his torture and the crucifixion. And the last thing, in the last part of verse 33, Jesus allowed his burial and resurrection. It says, and the third day he will rise again. In order to rise, what must happen before? You must be put into the grave. He allowed that. In fact, in Isaiah 53, verse 9, we understand that what would have been the typical thing is that he would have been seen as a criminal between the two criminals beside of him. He would have been thrown into maybe an open pit or something with all the criminals. But the prophecy said, no. They would plan on putting you with the wicked people, but you're actually going to be buried with the rich people, which is exactly what happened when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took him off the cross and put him in the brand new borrowed tomb of Joseph. Jesus knew he would be buried that way. Jesus knew he would be raised. He knew it. And he raced toward it. Because he knew that his crucifixion had to take place to lead to his resurrection, because that's the offering for sin that had to take place if any human being was to be rescued from the flames of hell. You know, policemen, firemen, medics, they race to the scenes, but the best they can do is temporally help people in a temporary danger. But they all have their own sin problems. There's only one sinless one who could be the responder to the eternal emergency of sin. And Jesus knew he was the one. That's why he did it. Why was his death, though, so horrific? Why didn't he just go to sleep one night and die in his sleep? Why did the Father allow his death to be so horrific? Have you ever heard the term, the punishment must fit the crime? Our sin is such an offense to God, our Creator, that the torture that his Son went through is reflective of the offense God takes toward our sin. The punishment needs to fit the crime. Jesus paid the punishment for our sin, and then he conquered it through his resurrection, so that anybody who knows who Jesus is and what he did and allows Jesus to apply his sacrifice offering to our account before God, they might be saved. What better day in the history of your life than an Easter Resurrection Sunday to know who Jesus is and what he did, and to allow him to save you the way he made that possible? I want you to bow your heads right now, because right now this is between you and the Lord. If you're coming to the place of realizing this and you believe this, he doesn't force you, but if you will allow him, by praying to him and saying, Jesus, I believe what you've done, all these things, and you did it willingly, I am asking you to apply it to my account before your Father. Please save me and forgive me. What better day to do that than on Easter Resurrection Sunday? If you want to be saved and you realize I've never been saved, you just pray, Jesus, I understand. Please save me and become king of my life.